Hello everyone. Sorry this video is a bit later than planned, my fault, but I wanted to make sure I got this one right. Today I'm going to be doing my first console history video. I'm going to be starting with the Sega Genesis or Megadrive, mainly because its 30th birthday was 3 days ago at the time I record this. It came out August 13th, 1989, and it's now been 30 years since the release of this system. So I thought what we're going to do is just going to talk about the history of it, how it was successful, the add-ons, just basically talking about the Genesis for as long as I can talk about the Genesis for. So, hope you enjoy. Let's get started. The Sega Genesis is probably most famous for being part of the biggest console war in history. The Genesis versus the Super Nintendo. The weird thing about that, though, is the Genesis was never actually released to compete with the Super Nintendo, because the Super Nintendo came out 2 years later. 3 years if you include the Japanese release, which was in 1988. The Genesis was meant to compete with the original NES, because the NES was super successful in the United States and Japan, and Sega's system, which was the Master System, was not successful in those regions. Was successful in other regions, but Sega's policy of hardware is, if it's not successful, forget about it, move on, something new, let's try it and see what happens. This is the one time that it worked. It worked with the Genesis and then never really worked again, which we'll get more into in a moment. But the Genesis, being most famous for that console war, it wasn't even designed to compete with that. The Super Nintendo was a strike against the Genesis, because the Genesis was really showing up for the NES, obviously, because it's a 16-bit console compared to the 8-bit NES. So Nintendo had to strike back, and that birthed that console war. So it's weird to think about that. But then obviously, the Genesis, once the Super Nintendo came out, the Genesis was weaker in almost every way. The CPU clock speed in the Genesis is slightly faster than the SNES, which is why Sega came up with the marketing term of blast processing. Nobody knew what it meant, but it sounded cool and it was something the SNES didn't have. That's what it was all about, that console war. It was, what doesn't the other one have? Like, SNES has Zelda, Genesis has Sonic. Back then Sonic was cool. But that's what it was about. It was mainly about who had the best games, and each company making better games for their system, because that's all you had. Who could make the best games? And if your system didn't have the better games, it wasn't going to win. The reason both of them did so well is because both of them had such great games on them. But the Genesis started to look old by the time the SNES came out. So what Sega did was, they released an add-on called the Sega CD, which is designed to be attached to the Genesis in this expansion port here. This expansion port here is where the Sega CD would attach, and it would sit underneath the Genesis. I don't have that, unfortunately. It's a pretty rare piece of equipment now, but that was meant to improve the Genesis to what the SNES could do, in theory. But most developers never took advantage of that. They either just made games for the Genesis because it was the more common platform, or if they did make games for the Sega CD, they'd be glorified movies, essentially. Like point-and-click stuff, or interactive movies. It wasn't really taken advantage of the way that Sega would have wanted, and therefore it was mostly considered a failure. But Nintendo didn't see it as a failure. They saw it as a serious competitor, meaning that they wanted to go and create their own CD add-on called the SNES CD, and that's a whole another mess of a story which would take way too long to go into here and doesn't have anything to do with the Genesis, funnily enough. So I'll save that for another video, but that will be an interesting thing to talk about. But what Nintendo ended up doing, long story short, that plan didn't really work. So they made the Super FX chip, which again showed up the Genesis, because now SNES games were capable of 3D rendering for some instances, and the Genesis definitely couldn't do that. So they created the 32X, which would sit on the top of the Genesis, go in the cartridge port. It would sit on top and connect a million wires behind the Genesis and have its own separate power supply. And that was a failure. Like, there's no even like, oh, it could have been. No, it was terrible. It pretty much destroyed Sega as a hardware manufacturer. That and probably the Saturn as well. Although the Saturn was actually good. But the Genesis is easily Sega's most successful console, easily their most well-known console. And most would argue probably their best console. I mean, the only other argument most people would probably bring up is the Dreamcast, which, I prefer the Dreamcast. But the Genesis is pretty much the best way to start retro collecting because, like I said, there's so many games for it and it's sold so well that they're pretty common. Since it's not made by Nintendo, it doesn't really hold value as much as a Nintendo system. Most Nintendo systems are still pretty expensive. The Genesis, I got mine for £25 with the controller and a game and all the cables and stuff. So, the Genesis succeeded mainly off of Sega's brilliant marketing and their brilliant games, because when it came out, the Genesis was superior to the NES, so Sega made the slogan, Genesis does what Nintendo don't. It's just simple marketing things like that that really put it into popularity. And then everyone was basically, it was a proper, like, argument, like, all around. It's like, Genesis has this, yeah, but the NES and SNES have this. That's basically what they marketed on. And it was the first proper console war, and the biggest console war, most famous. But Sega's marketing and great games really put the Genesis on top. They did release another add-on for the Genesis, which was lesser known, but it was harmless, because it didn't need its own power supply. It wasn't super complicated. You see, Sega's previous console, the Master System, wasn't so successful in America, but it was really successful in Europe and especially South America. So Sega put everything you would need to play the Master System into the Genesis. Essentially, there's a Master System in there, but the cartridges are different shapes, so you can't put them into the Genesis. So Sega released the Power Base Converter, which is a small piece of plastic that goes on top of the Genesis here. It only works on the Model 1. There's other models of the Genesis, there's hundreds of other models of the Genesis, but it only fits in the Model 1 because of the circular shape on the top. And you can put Master System cartridges and cards into it. So, Genesis's 3 add-ons, not too successful, but Sega CD is the most successful hardware add-on, so I mean, there is that. Genesis cartridge would look like that. It would sit in the top like that. And this is Sonic 1. This is the best-selling game on the Genesis. It's a good game. This is back when Sonic was cool, guys. That was actually one of the biggest arguments for the Genesis, that it had Sonic the Hedgehog. Because back then, playing Sonic was cool, and the games were good. And then, obviously, you have the controller for the Genesis, which back then was revolutionary. I mean, like, the way it's designed is really comfortable even today. Like, I mean, on the back, it's got perfect, like, grip. Like, you'd think it's old and clunky and not very comfortable, but it actually fits in the hand perfectly well. Like, I mean, 3 buttons kind of led to some problems, especially when the SNES came out. So they released a 6-button controller, which I don't have, but I've used it, and the 3-button controller feels better. It's more comfortable. But overall, the Genesis never beat the SNES. The Genesis lost slightly. But it proved something to everyone in the industry. It proved you didn't have to be named Nintendo to make money making video game hardware. And that sent a bunch of different companies off making their own consoles for the next generation. And they all failed. Except for Sony, who made the PlayStation, which was successful. And that was partially Sega's fault when they got into the Sega Saturn. Because if we come back to 32X, when they released that, the Saturn had already came out in Japan. And people knew that. So basically customers would ask, why would I buy this Sega 32X thing when you've got this Saturn coming out in less than a year? So people never bought the 32X. But people who did got burnt by Sega because a year later the Saturn came out, and that's like, right, we're not going to make games for the 32X anymore, that's done. We're going to make Saturn. But then people are like, wait, so I just spent all this money buying this 32X thing, and now you're saying, we're done with that? I have to go buy a Saturn at $400? It didn't work. And then what's worse is, since the Saturn didn't do well, you ended up with the head of Sega saying to public that the Saturn was not Sega's future. Essentially, he told the world, don't buy a Sega Saturn. That's still probably the worst mistake in gaming history, maybe other than the 32X, but that's still on the top 5. It's hard to think about something worse than saying, don't buy our system, it's not our future. Like, I don't know what he was thinking. It was an honest answer, but you don't say that. You never say you don't have faith in your product, because then nobody else has faith in it, and then no one buys it. And then the Dreamcast came out, and that failed because of 32X and the Saturn, leaving essentially a bad taste in customers' mouths, because they're like, well, what if this doesn't succeed? You're just going to release something else 2 years later? And then they had to discontinue the Dreamcast 2 years after it came out, because they ran out of money. So the Genesis was really the only successful system Sega ever had. And there was tons of great games. Like, you have the entire Sonic series, you have the Vector Man series, you have Rise Star, you have Golden Axe, Altered Beast, Street Fighter 2, Mortal Kombat with the blood. That's why the Genesis version is better, because it actually has the blood. The SNES version has the green blood, which isn't, that's not Mortal Kombat. And then Genesis also kind of helped create ratings for games. Mainly a Sega CD game called Night Trap was really the main thing used against video game violence. I know. This is when that argument was around, and it kind of made sense because video games were becoming popular and they were new. They weren't what they are now. They were just starting off. So it kind of made sense for that argument to come out then. But basically, Night Trap existed, and the US government didn't like that, because from their point of view, it was like a bunch of like criminals kidnapping this woman, even though what you're meant to do is it's like you play as a security guard or something, and you have to watch this like family to protect them from these burglars. But what everyone got the idea of is that you are the burglars and you're encouraged to kidnap the woman. So Sega's system was seen as like the more adult system. Like, the Nintendo stuff was for the kids, but Sega had the mature stuff. Like, they had the mature games on Sega CD, like Night Trap and things like that. They had Mortal Kombat with the blood. So Sega did have a rating system, but then it was like irrelevant, basically. Nintendo's lawyer basically destroyed Sega, throwing them under the bus, even though they're technically on the same side. But, Genesis was really successful. And it's kind of because of that success that they failed. Because mainly arrogance. Like, they mucked up with the Saturn and the 32X. There'll be interesting videos to make, like why the Saturn failed, and just the story of the 32X more in general. So, but the Genesis has great games on it, and it's really easy to find. It's a really great system, and even if you don't want to go buy the system, there's a classic version either out now or pretty soon it's coming out. Like, it's coming out soon, and that has 42 games on the 42 classic Genesis games built in, 2 controllers. It's a decent deal, honestly. But you can't go wrong with the Sega Genesis. So, I mean, that's pretty much it, honestly. Like, I mean, I think probably could have gone into more detail on certain things, but I don't want the video to be half an hour long because, I mean, I want people to remain interested. And I realize it's kind of hard to do. So, but before we go, I just want to talk about what I might be doing, like, as an upload schedule. If there's 4 weeks in a month, like an average month has 4 weeks, so that'd be 4 times I upload. I'm thinking once a month I do a video like this where I talk about a specific console, like its entire history. Then another video would be like why something failed or succeeded, kind of like what I did with the Xbox 360 a while back. And then the other two can be random videos of like your choice. Like you leave a comment saying, "Hey, make this. I'll see what I can do." So you guys can say if that's a good idea or not, and I'll see what I can do. I'm sorry this video is out a bit later, but I really wanted to make sure I had everything like as good as possible. This probably won't be perfect. Like, I mean, I'll probably come back to this in like 5 years or something and update it, and it'll be much better. Hopefully the video quality will have improved a bit by then. Alright, well I'm gonna go now. Thanks guys. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed. Dislike if you didn't enjoy. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.